The fluorescent lights on the 42nd floor had been dead for hours. Only moonlight sliced through the glass walls, catching the silhouette of a woman curled into herself behind a mahogany desk worth more than most people's yearly salary. Cassandra Hayes, CEO of TechNova, face of a billion-dollar empire, was sobbing into her palms like a child. Raymond froze in the doorway, mop handle still dripping. His worn sneakers squeaked against marble. She snapped upright, mascara bleeding down her cheeks, and her voice cracked like a whip through the silence. "Peek again, and you're fired." He lowered his eyes, steadied his breath. And what came out of this single father's mouth next would unravel everything she thought she knew about power, loneliness, and the price of success. Raymond kept his gaze fixed on the wet marble beneath his feet, counting the seconds in his head the way he always did when panic threatened to swallow him whole. 1, 2, 3. His daughter's face flashed behind his eyes, her gap-toothed smile, her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb every morning before he left for his shift. 4, 5. He could not lose this job. The words rose in his throat like bile, but when they finally emerged, they carried none of the fear churning in his stomach. "I apologize, ma'am. I didn't see anything. I have a little girl at home, and this job is all we have. I'll finish the other floors first." His voice remained steady, almost gentle, as though he were speaking to a wounded animal rather than the most powerful woman in the building. Cassandra's breath hitched. She had expected groveling, perhaps even tears, the desperate scrambling she had witnessed from executives twice this man's age, when their careers hung by a thread. Instead, this janitor in his faded uniform stood before her with a dignity that made her own crumbling composure feel obscene. The moonlight caught the silver streaks in his close-cropped hair, the deep lines carved around his eyes from years of sleepless nights and early mornings. He turned without another word, his mop bucket squeaking against the floor as he retreated toward the elevator. The door closed behind him with a soft chime, and Cassandra was alone again, with the silence and the weight of her empire pressing down on her chest like a stone. Raymond's hands trembled as the elevator descended, floor after floor, the numbers blinking past in a blur of green light. He had been working the night shift at TechNova for nearly 2 years now, invisible to the thousands of employees who flooded through these halls during daylight hours. He knew every corner of this building, every forgotten supply closet, every bathroom where executives sometimes hid to cry or scream into their phones. But he had never seen the CEO herself, not like that. Not stripped of all the armor that money and power could buy. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to find a text from his neighbor, Delia, who watched Hazel on the nights he worked. "She's asking for you again. Won't sleep until she hears your voice." He pressed the phone to his ear the moment Delia picked up, and his daughter's sleepy voice crackled through the speaker like a lifeline thrown across dark water. "Daddy? Did you save anyone tonight?" Hazel asked him this every time he called, a ritual that had started when she was 4, and he had told her that even janitors could be heroes, that keeping things clean and safe was its own kind of magic. Raymond leaned against the elevator wall and smiled, despite the exhaustion pulling at his bones. "Not tonight, sweetheart. But I kept the building standing. That counts for something, doesn't it?" He could hear her giggle, that high, bright sound that made every aching muscle worth it, and he promised to bring her favorite donut in the morning before hanging up. The apartment waited for him at the edge of the city, a 2-room space above a laundromat where the dryers hummed all night like mechanical lullabies. Raymond had moved here 3 years ago after the funeral, after the hospital bills had devoured everything he and Linda had built together. He still remembered the weight of his wife in his arms during those final weeks, the way her fingers had grown so thin he could see the bones beneath her skin. She had made him promise to take care of Hazel, to give their daughter everything they had dreamed of together, and he had sworn it on his own breath, his own beating heart. Now he worked 3 jobs and slept in fragments, stitching together a life from whatever scraps the world threw his way. Delia met him at the door with a cup of coffee already cooling in her weathered hands, her gray hair pinned back beneath a faded kerchief. She had lived next door for as long as Raymond could remember, a retired school teacher who had lost her own husband to the same cancer that had taken Linda. They rarely spoke about their grief, but it hung between them like a shared language, a bond that required no translation. "She drew you another picture," Delia said, pressing a folded piece of paper into his palm. "Wouldn't let me see it. Said it was a secret between you two." Raymond unfolded the drawing in the dim hallway light and felt his throat tighten. Hazel had sketched a castle in the clouds, with a tiny stick figure standing at the gates. Underneath, in her wobbly handwriting, she had written, "Daddy's office." He tucked the drawing into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, and stepped into the apartment where Hazel lay sprawled across the couch, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. She had Linda's nose, Linda's stubborn chin, the same way of furrowing her brow when she was thinking hard about something. Raymond lifted her carefully, feeling her small body curl against his shoulder, and carried her to the bedroom they shared. The mattress was old and lumpy, bought second-hand from a neighbor who was moving away, but Hazel never complained. She believed her father was a hero, and heroes did not need soft beds or fancy things. He kissed her forehead and watched her settle into dreams before retreating to the kitchen to count the bills spread across the table like fallen leaves. The medical debt was a mountain that never seemed to shrink, no matter how many hours he worked or how many meals he skipped. Linda's treatment had cost more than their house, more than everything they had saved during 10 years of marriage, and the hospital had been relentless in their collection efforts. Raymond had sold the car, the furniture, Linda's jewelry, everything except her wedding ring, which he kept in a small box beneath his pillow. Sometimes, late at night, he would hold it in his palm and whisper to her across whatever distance separated them now. "I'm trying, Lynn. I'm doing my best." The ring was cold against his skin, but he swore he could feel warmth there, a faint pulse of something that might have been hope. 3 days passed before Raymond returned to the 42nd floor. He had been avoiding it deliberately, scrubbing every other level with meticulous care while the executive suite remained untouched. His supervisor had noticed, of course, a thick-necked man named Gerald, who took pleasure in reminding the night staff exactly how replaceable they were. "Hayes wants her office cleaned by midnight," Gerald had barked at him earlier that evening, shoving a keycard into his chest. "Don't make me tell her you've been slacking." Raymond had swallowed his response and taken the elevator up alone, his mop bucket rattling beside him like an old friend. The building felt different at this hour, hollow and vast, as though all the ambition and greed that filled it during the day had drained away, leaving only echoes behind. Cassandra's office door stood slightly open, a sliver of warm light spilling across the marble threshold. Raymond hesitated, memories of her tear-streaked face flashing through his mind, before knocking twice against the doorframe. "Come in," her voice called, steadier now but still carrying an edge of something fragile. He pushed the door open and found her seated at her desk, papers scattered before her like the remnants of a battle she was losing. She looked up at him without recognition at first, her eyes glazed with exhaustion, and then something shifted in her expression. "You, the janitor from the other night." Raymond nodded, keeping his gaze respectfully lowered. "I can come back later if you prefer, ma'am. Just here to clean." She studied him for a long moment, her pen suspended above whatever document she had been signing. The moonlight was kinder tonight, softened by the glow of her desk lamp, and Raymond could see the shadows beneath her eyes, the tight line of her jaw. "You didn't tell anyone," she said finally, "about what you saw." It was not a question. Raymond shook his head, beginning to empty the wastebasket beside her desk into his cart. "Not my story to tell, ma'am. Everyone has nights when the walls close in. I've had plenty myself." Cassandra's lips parted, as though she wanted to say something else, but the words seemed to catch somewhere between her throat and the air. She returned to her papers, and Raymond continued his work in silence, sweeping away the day's debris with practiced efficiency. He was nearly finished when he noticed the journal lying open beside her keyboard, its pages covered in handwriting that slanted heavily to the right. Raymond did not mean to read it. He had trained himself long ago to become invisible, to see without seeing, to clean around the intimate artifacts of other people's lives without absorbing any of it. But the words seemed to leap from the page, burning themselves into his mind before he could look away. Success means nothing when you have no one to share it with. He set the journal aside carefully, positioning it exactly as he had found it, and something in his chest twisted with a recognition he had not expected. The loneliness in those words was a mirror he knew too well. That night, Raymond did something he had never done in all his years of cleaning other people's spaces. He tore a page from the small notebook he carried for grocery lists and wrote a single line in his careful, blocky handwriting. "You are not as alone as you think." He folded the paper into a square and slipped it beneath the journal's cover, positioning it so she would find it when she next reached for the pen. He did not sign it. He did not need to. The kindness was in the gesture itself, offered without expectation, without hope of return. Raymond finished mopping the floor and let himself out quietly, leaving the 42nd floor behind him like a secret he was learning to keep. Cassandra found the note the following evening, when the building had emptied and the silence had grown thick enough to suffocate. She unfolded it with trembling fingers, reading the words once, twice, a third time before pressing the paper to her chest. No one had spoken to her with kindness in longer than she could remember. Her board members saw her as a weapon to be wielded, her investors as a machine that produced quarterly returns. She had assistants who anticipated her every need, and lawyers who shielded her from every threat. But none of them had ever looked at her the way that janitor had, with something that felt almost like understanding. She tucked the note into her pocket and sat alone in the dark, wondering who this Raymond was and what wounds he carried that allowed him to recognize hers. The weeks that followed took on a strange rhythm, a dance neither of them acknowledged aloud. Raymond would arrive at the 42nd floor after midnight, when the rest of the building slept, and Cassandra would be waiting at her desk, papers scattered before her like a shield against whatever pursued her through the daylight hours. They spoke rarely at first, exchanging only the barest pleasantries, but the silence between them grew comfortable, companionable, weighted with all the things they were not yet ready to say. Raymond learned that she drank her coffee black and stayed in the office until her eyes could no longer focus on the screen. Cassandra learned that he hummed old jazz standards while he worked, his voice low and rough, like sandpaper smoothed by years of use. One night, she broke the silence with a question that hung in the air between them like smoke. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Raymond paused, his mop suspended above the gleaming floor, and considered the weight of what she was asking. He thought of Linda, of the future they had planned together, of the man he had imagined becoming before grief had carved him into something sharper and more fragile. "Every day," he admitted quietly. "But I've got a little girl who needs me to keep going, so I do." Cassandra's eyes softened, and for the first time since he had met her, Raymond saw something other than armor in her gaze. "Tell me about her," she said, and the question sounded almost like a plea. He told her about Hazel, about her drawings of castles in the sky, about the way she asked him every night if he had saved anyone at work. He told her about Linda, about the cancer that had stolen her piece by piece, about the promises he had made in that hospital room when he could barely breathe through his own sobbing. He told her about the bills that never stopped coming, about the jobs he juggled like weights that threatened to crush him, about the moments when he stood on the rooftop of their apartment building and wondered if the falling would be easier than the fighting. Cassandra listened without interrupting, her coffee growing cold beside her, and when he finally fell silent, she reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. The touch lasted only a moment, but Raymond felt it burning long after she had pulled away. His phone shattered the moment with its harsh electronic cry, Delia's name flashing across the screen like a warning. Raymond answered with his heart already climbing into his throat, and the words hit him like a physical blow. Hazel. Hospital. Fever. He was running before he realized he had moved, the mop clattering to the floor behind him, the elevator taking too long, always too long. Cassandra watched him go with her hand still extended toward the space where he had stood, and something cracked open inside her chest, something she had kept locked away for longer than she could remember. She thought of her own mother, gone now for 20 years, of the last words they had spoken in anger, of all the chances she had wasted believing there would always be more time. The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and fear, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. Raymond held Hazel's stuffed rabbit in his lap, its fur worn thin from years of being dragged across playgrounds and clutched through nightmares. The doctors spoke to him in careful phrases, their voices calibrated to deliver devastation without sharp edges. Pneumonia. Aggressive. They needed to run more tests. They needed to keep her overnight. They needed payment arrangements, insurance verification, a signature on forms that seemed to multiply every time he looked away. Raymond signed everything they put in front of him, his handwriting barely recognizable, his mind already calculating the cost of this latest blow to a budget that had no room left to absorb it. Hazel's room was small and white, the bed too big for her tiny frame, tubes running from her arms like rivers carrying medicine toward a sea of uncertainty. She opened her eyes when he took her hand, her voice thin and reedy. "Daddy, did I make you miss work?" The question broke something inside him, some last reserve of strength he had been hoarding for moments exactly like this. He crawled into the bed beside her, careful of the wires and monitors, and held her against his chest, while her breathing rattled and wheezed. "You're more important than any job in the world," he whispered into her hair. "You're my whole universe, Hazel girl. Everything I do is for you." He did not sleep that night, watching instead the rise and fall of her chest, listening to the machines that tracked her heartbeat, like a metronome counting down toward something he refused to name. The nurses came and went, adjusting IVs, checking vital signs, their faces carefully neutral in that way. Medical professionals learned to survive their work. By morning, Hazel's fever had broken, but the doctors wanted to keep her for observation, wanted to ensure the infection had truly retreated. Raymond called Gerald to explain he would not be at work, bracing himself for the lecture, the threats, the reminder of how many desperate people were waiting to take his place. But the voice on the other end was not Gerald's. It was a woman from Human Resources, professional and apologetic, informing him that his daughter's treatment had been approved under a supplemental insurance policy he had not known he possessed. Raymond stared at his phone long after the call had ended, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. TechNova offered health insurance to its full-time employees, but custodial staff were classified as contractors, ineligible for benefits. He knew this because he had asked about it when he was first hired, when Linda was still alive, and they were drowning in medical debt. Someone had made a mistake, he thought. Someone had checked the wrong box on a form, and when they discovered the error, they would come for every penny and more. But the woman had sounded certain, almost rehearsed, as though she had been expecting his confusion. She had even mentioned a name, a policy number, documentation that apparently existed in some file somewhere bearing his signature that he could not remember signing. The card arrived that afternoon, slipped beneath Hazel's door by a nurse who shrugged when Raymond asked who had delivered it. The envelope was simple white cardstock, the handwriting inside elegant and slanted, achingly familiar. "Get well soon, little dreamer. The clouds are waiting for you." Raymond's breath caught. He knew that handwriting. He had seen it spilling across journal pages, confessing loneliness to an empty room. Cassandra. She had done this. Somehow, impossibly, she had reached through the machinery of her corporation and pulled strings that should not have been hers to pull. He should have been angry at the intrusion, the assumption that he needed saving. Instead, he felt only a warmth spreading through his chest, melting ice he had not known was there. Hazel recovered slowly, her strength returning in increments that felt like miracles to a father who had spent too many nights bargaining with a god he was not sure he believed in. Raymond returned to work the following week, but something had shifted in the texture of his evenings. He found himself lingering on the 42nd floor, finding reasons to pass by Cassandra's office, even when his route did not require it. She was always there, always working, but now she would look up when he entered, would smile in a way that softened the sharp lines of her face. They talked about small things at first, safe things, the weather and the news, and the peculiarities of office politics. But gradually, the conversations deepened, becoming excavations into territory neither of them had shared with anyone else. He told her about Linda, really told her this time, about the woman she had been before the illness, about her laugh that could fill a room, about the way she had looked at him on their wedding day, like he was the answer to a question she had been asking her whole life. Cassandra told him about her father, a man who had built TechNova from nothing, and then died before he could see what it became, leaving her to shoulder an empire she had never wanted. She told him about the loneliness that came with power, the way people stopped seeing you as human the moment you signed your name on a check worth more than their lives. She told him about the night he had found her crying, how she had been ready to walk away from everything, how his simple words had made her reconsider. One evening, Raymond brought something to their conversation that he had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket and smoothed it against her desk, revealing Hazel's drawing, the castle in the clouds, the tiny figure at the gates. Cassandra studied it for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she laughed, a sound so unexpected and pure that Raymond felt his own smile breaking through against his will. "She thinks this is where I work," he explained. "A castle in the sky. She doesn't know about the mops and the buckets and the people who look right through me. She just knows her daddy goes somewhere beautiful every night." Cassandra traced the crayon lines with her fingertip, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "I want to meet her," Cassandra said, and the words hung between them like an invitation to something neither of them had named. Raymond hesitated, thinking of all the reasons this was a terrible idea, all the ways their worlds were incompatible, all the pain that could come from building bridges across chasms this wide. But then he thought of Hazel, of the way she looked at him with absolute faith, of the future he was fighting to give her one exhausting day at a time. "The company Christmas party," he said finally. "I'm supposed to work it, but Delia can't watch her that night, so I was going to bring her anyway, keep her in the break room where nobody would notice." Cassandra's smile widened, and Raymond saw something in it that looked almost like hope. The party was everything Raymond had expected and nothing he was prepared for. The executive floor had been transformed into a winter wonderland, white lights dripping from every surface, champagne flowing like water, men and women in suits, worth more than his annual salary, laughing at jokes that seemed to require advanced degrees to understand. Hazel clutched his hand, her eyes wide with wonder. Her best dress, which was really her only dress, slightly too short because she had grown 3 inches since Linda had bought it for her. Raymond guided her toward the service elevator, planning to slip them both down to the basement, where the catering staff congregated between courses. But Hazel stopped at the edge of the ballroom, transfixed by the spectacle before her. "Daddy," she breathed. "It's like the castle. He should have hurried her along. He should have kept to the shadows as he always did, invisible and efficient. The machinery that kept beautiful things running without ever being acknowledged. But something made him pause, made him let her look, made him wish for just one moment that he could give her this world instead of the one waiting for them in their cramped apartment above the laundromat." That was when the champagne tower fell. Later, Raymond would piece together what had happened. How Hazel had wandered toward the gleaming pyramid of glasses. How her elbow had caught the edge of the table. How gravity and physics had conspired to send $300 worth of vintage Dom Perignon cascading across the most expensive dress in the room. Cassandra stood motionless, champagne dripping from her gown, her expression unreadable as every eye in the room swiveled toward the scene. Raymond was already moving, apologies spilling from his lips, reaching for napkins that seemed laughably inadequate against the scope of the disaster. But Cassandra was not looking at him. She was looking at Hazel, at the little girl whose face had crumpled into a mask of terror, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized what she had done. And then something extraordinary happened. Cassandra Hayes, CEO of TechNova, architect of a billion-dollar empire, dropped to her knees in the middle of the ballroom floor, ruining her Valentino gown beyond any hope of salvage, and took Hazel's hands in her own. "Hey," she said softly, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the watching crowd. "It's just a dress. They make more of them every day. Are you okay?" Hazel stared at her with tear-bright eyes, lower lip trembling, and asked the question that would change everything. "Are you okay? You look sad." The words struck Cassandra like a blow, simple and devastating in their honesty. Children saw what adults trained themselves to ignore. They cut through pretense with the precision of surgeons, exposing wounds that wealth and power could not bandage. Cassandra felt the tears rising before she could stop them, felt the careful architecture of her composure crumbling for the second time in front of this janitor and his impossible daughter. "I'm sad," she admitted, loud enough for only the 3 of them to hear. "I've been sad for a very long time. But meeting you has made me feel a little bit better." Raymond watched the scene unfold like a dream he would not dare to remember upon waking. The whispers of the crowd faded to white noise, the stares of executives who had never once acknowledged his existence becoming irrelevant in the face of what was happening before him. His daughter, his 6-year-old warrior in her too short dress, had just done something he had not been able to accomplish in all his weeks of late-night conversations. She had made Cassandra Hayes honest. "Ma'am," he said quietly, offering his hand to help her rise. "Why don't you come have Christmas dinner with us? It's nothing fancy, just soup and sandwiches in a little apartment. But it's warm, and nobody there will care about your dress." Cassandra looked up at him, champagne still beating in her hair, mascara beginning its familiar migration down her cheeks, and Raymond saw the moment she made her decision. It flickered across her face, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, a crack in the armor she had worn so long she had forgotten what lay beneath. "I would like that," she said, and her voice carried a tremor he had never heard before, the sound of someone stepping off a cliff and trusting the fall. She rose to her feet, took Hazel's hand on one side and Raymond's on the other, and walked through the parting crowd toward the elevator. Behind them, the party continued as though nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Everything. The apartment seemed even smaller with Cassandra in it, her designer gown now wrapped in one of Delia's old robes, her bare feet tucked beneath her on the couch that Raymond had found abandoned on a street corner 3 years ago. Hazel had appointed herself hostess, presenting their guest with a chipped mug of hot chocolate and a tour of every drawing taped to the refrigerator door. Raymond watched from the kitchen, stirring soup that came from a can, and wondering how his life had arrived at this impossible moment. The CEO of the company where he cleaned toilets was sitting in his living room, laughing at his daughter's jokes, looking more at peace than he had ever seen her in the gleaming towers of her empire. They ate at the small folding table, 3 mismatched chairs pulled close together, paper napkins and plastic cups, and a warmth that had nothing to do with the radiator clanking against the wall. Cassandra told stories about her father, about the garage where TechNova had been born, about the dreams he had chased with nothing but determination and a belief that technology could change the world. Hazel listened with rapt attention, asking questions that made Cassandra pause and consider her answers with unusual care. Raymond said little, content to watch the two of them together, to witness something he had not dared to imagine taking shape before his eyes. When Hazel finally fell asleep against Cassandra's shoulder, exhausted by excitement and hot chocolate, the silence that remained was not empty. It was full. "I don't know how to do this," Cassandra whispered, looking down at the child in her arms with an expression Raymond recognized from his own reflection. "I've spent my whole life learning how to run a company. Nobody taught me how to be a person." Raymond reached across the table and took her hand, her fingers cold against his calloused palm. "You're already doing it," he said. "You showed up. You stayed. That's the whole secret, Cassandra. Just keep showing up." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the woman behind the title, the lonely girl who had inherited an empire she never asked for, the human being searching for something money could not buy. "Call me Cass," she said. "Nobody has called me that since my father died." The weeks after Christmas brought changes that rippled through TechNova like stones dropped in still water. Cassandra implemented new policies that baffled her board of directors, raising wages for contract workers, introducing paid family leave, creating wellness programs that treated employees as human beings rather than resources to be optimized. She cited efficiency studies and retention metrics to justify the changes, but Raymond knew the truth. She was building the company her father had dreamed of, the one that had gotten lost somewhere along the way to becoming a billion-dollar machine. And she was doing it because a little girl in a too-short dress had asked if she was okay, and for the first time in decades, someone had listened to her answer. Raymond received the call on a Tuesday afternoon, summoned to the Human Resources Department with no explanation. He expected the worst, as he always did, bracing himself for the termination that would surely come once someone realized the janitor had been spending his nights talking to the CEO. But the woman who greeted him was smiling, sliding a folder across the desk with his name printed on the cover. "Ms. Hayes has created a new position," she explained. "Director of Employee Wellness. She asked for you specifically." Raymond stared at the salary figure, at the benefits package, at the words that seemed to rearrange themselves every time he tried to make sense of them. It was 3 times what he earned from all his jobs combined. It was enough to pay off Linda's medical bills. It was enough to give Hazel the life he had promised his dying wife. He found Cassandra in her office that evening, standing at the window, watching the city lights blink to life below. She did not turn when he entered, but he could see her reflection in the glass, could see the uncertainty written across her features. "You don't have to take it," she said quietly. "I should have asked you first. I just wanted to give you options, Raymond. I wanted to give you a chance to stop fighting so hard." He crossed the room to stand beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin, close enough to see the pulse jumping in her throat. "I'm not taking it because of the money," he said. "I'm taking it because you believed I could be more than what everyone else saw. Because you looked at a janitor and saw a director." She turned to face him, and the distance between them collapsed like a bridge finally completed. "What else do you see?" she asked, and the question held everything she was afraid to say, every hope she had been nursing in secret, every fear that this fragile thing growing between them might shatter at the slightest touch. Raymond reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his roughened fingers gentle against her cheek. I see a woman who forgot how to be lonely because a little girl asked if she was okay. I see someone who could have had anything in the world and chose soup and sandwiches in a cramped apartment. I see the person you've been hiding all along, Cass, and I think she's extraordinary. The kiss that followed was not the stuff of fairy tales, not a dramatic conclusion scored by orchestral swells. It was tentative and searching. Two people who had both lost too much learning how to reach for something new. Hazel would tease them about it later, claiming she had known all along, pointing to her castle drawings as proof of her prophetic gifts. But in that moment, suspended in the glow of city lights, 42 floors above the world, Raymond and Cassandra were simply two lonely people who had found each other in the dark. The past could not be undone. The grief they carried would never fully fade. But the future, stretching before them like an unwritten story, suddenly seemed full of possibilities they had both stopped believing in. 6 months later, Cassandra received an offer that would have made her the youngest CEO of a Fortune 500 company, a position in New York that came with enough zeros to make her current salary look like pocket change. She read the letter 3 times, tracing the embossed letterhead with her fingertip, calculating what acceptance would mean for her career, her legacy, the empire her father had built. Then she picked up her phone and called Raymond. "They want me to move to New York," she said. "It's the opportunity of a lifetime." There was a long pause, and she could hear Hazel singing in the background, some nonsense song about clouds and castles that she had composed herself. "What are you going to do?" Raymond asked, and his voice carried no pressure, no expectation, only the quiet steadiness that had drawn her to him from the very first night. She declined the offer the next morning, typing her refusal with fingers that did not tremble, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. The board would be furious. The analysts would question her judgment. But Cassandra Hayes had spent too many years chasing a definition of success that left her crying alone in empty offices. She had found something better in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, in the gap-toothed smile of a little girl who drew castles in the sky, in the calloused hands of a janitor who had seen her at her worst and offered kindness instead of judgment. Some opportunities came once in a lifetime, but the life she was building with Raymond and Hazel felt like something rarer still, a second chance she had not known she was waiting for. The wedding was small, held in the community garden where Hazel had learned to plant tomatoes, attended by Delia and a handful of colleagues who had become genuine friends. Cassandra wore a simple white dress, nothing like the designer gowns that filled her closets, and Raymond wore the suit he had bought for Linda's funeral, altered now to fit the man he had become. Hazel served as flower girl and ring bearer and self-appointed wedding planner, her castle drawings incorporated into the decorations, her gap-toothed smile brighter than any of the string lights wound through the garden trees. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, she raised her hand to announce that she thought they should have more cake, and the laughter that followed carried no trace of the loneliness that had brought them all together. Raymond still mops floors sometimes, on nights when sleep won't come, and he needs to feel useful, to remember where he started. He walks the halls of TechNova, past the offices of executives who now nod at him with recognition, through the break rooms where custodial staff gather to share stories about their families and their dreams. The 42nd floor is different now. Warmth, where there was once only cold glass and colder ambition. Cassandra's office has photographs on the desk, drawings taped to the walls, evidence of a life being lived rather than merely survived. And sometimes, late at night, when the building is emptied and the silence grows thick, Raymond finds his wife still sitting there, working through problems that never seem to end. He sets down his mop and crosses to her desk, places his hands on her shoulders, and reminds her that it's time to go home. Hazel is 10 now. Her castle's grown more elaborate, her dreams reaching toward horizons her father could never have imagined. She talks about becoming an architect, about building real towers that touch real clouds, about creating spaces where lonely people can find each other and become families. She still asks Raymond every night if he saved anyone at work, but the question has changed meaning over the years. He tells her about the employee who needed emergency leave to care for a sick parent, about the custodian who received a scholarship for her daughter's college tuition, about all the small ways that kindness ripples outward when you give it permission to grow, and she listens with the same wonder she had at 4 years old, still believing her father is a hero, still drawing pictures of castles where he works. The sticky note still exists, preserved in a frame on Cassandra's desk, its ink faded, but its words still legible. You are not as alone as you think. She looks at it sometimes, when the pressures of running an empire threaten to overwhelm her, when the board demands sacrifices she's no longer willing to make, when she needs to remember why she stayed. Raymond gave her those words when he had nothing else to offer, when he was invisible to everyone who thought they mattered, when kindness was the only currency he could afford. It changed everything. Not because it was profound or poetic, but because it was true. Because sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. Because sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones we never thought to notice. They still have soup and sandwiches for Christmas dinner, though now the table is bigger, and the apartment is a house with a garden where Hazel plants tomatoes in the summer. Delia comes every year, her gray hair thinner, but her smile unchanged, and she tells stories about the days when Raymond used to knock on her door at 3 a.m, exhausted and desperate and determined to give his daughter a better life. Cassandra listens with tears in her eyes, marveling at the journey that brought them all to this table, this moment, this family stitched together from grief and hope and the stubborn refusal to stop believing in impossible things. The champagne they drink is expensive, but nobody cares about the vintage. They care about each other. That's the whole point. That's always been the whole point. On the anniversary of the night they met, Raymond and Cassandra returned to the 42nd floor, to the office where everything began. The moonlight still slices through the glass walls, still catches the mahogany desk, still paints silver shadows across the marble floor. But the woman standing at the window is not crying. She is laughing, her head thrown back, her hand clasped in her husband's, watching their daughter press her nose against the glass and trace the city lights with her finger. "This is where Daddy found you," Hazel says, her voice carrying the weight of a story she has heard 100 times, but never tires of telling. "This is where everything changed." Raymond pulls Cassandra close, feels her heartbeat against his chest, and thinks about all the nights he spent invisible in this building, all the floors he scrubbed while dreams died inside him one by one. "Peek again and you're fired," Cassandra whispers, and the words are different now, transformed by everything that has happened since she first spoke them in desperation and shame. Raymond kisses her forehead, tastes the salt of tears she is no longer afraid to shed, and gives her the answer he has been carrying for years. "I never stopped looking," he says, "and I never will." The castle in the clouds was never just a drawing. It was a prophecy. It was a promise. It was the truth that a 6-year-old saw more clearly than all the executives in their towers of glass and steel. Somewhere between the mop bucket and the mahogany desk, between the soup cans and the champagne, between the grief of what was lost and the hope of what was found, 3 lonely people became a family. And that, in the end, was the only success that ever mattered. The only empire worth building. the only story worth telling. Sometimes the smallest gestures change everything. Sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones we never thought to notice. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, a single moment of honesty can open doors we didn't know were there, leading to rooms we were always meant to occupy, filled with people we were always meant to love. This is that story. This is their story. This is the story of a janitor and a CEO, a little girl and her castle in the clouds, a sticky note and a Christmas dinner, and a lifetime of showing up when it mattered most. It began with tears and ended with laughter. It began with a threat and ended with a promise. It began in the dark and found its way, slowly, beautifully, inevitably, toward the light. Peek again and you're fired. He looked anyway, and everything changed.